Welcome to SLP Nerdcast. I'm Kate.
And I'm Amy, and we appreciate you tuning in. In our podcast, we will review and provide commentary on resources, literature, and discussed issues related to the field of speech-language pathology.
You can use this podcast for ASHA professional development. For more information about us and certification maintenance hours, go to our website, www.slpnerdcast.com. SLP Nerdcast is brought to you in part by listeners like you. You can support our work by going to our website or social media pages and contributing. You can also find permanent products, notes, and other handouts, including a handout for this episode. Some items are free, others are not, but everything is always affordable. Visit our website, www.slpnerdcast.com, to submit a call for papers to come on the show and present with us. Contact us anytime on Facebook, Instagram, or at info@slpnerdcast.com. We love hearing from our listeners, and we can't wait to learn what you have to teach us.
Just a quick disclaimer, the contents of this episode are not meant to replace clinical advice. SLP Nerdcast, its hosts, and its guests do not represent or endorse specific products or procedures mentioned during our episodes unless otherwise stated. We are not PhDs, but we do research our material. We do our best to provide a thorough review and fair representation of each topic that we tackle. That being said, it is always likely that there is an article we've missed or another perspective that isn't shared. If you have something to add to the conversation, please email us. We would love to hear from you.
Before we get started in today's episodes, financial and non-financial disclosures, I am the owner and founder of Grand Bois Therapy and Consulting, LLC, and co-founder of SLP Nerdcast. Amy Wonka is an employee of a public school system and co-founder of SLP Nerdcast. We're both members of ASHA SIG 12 and both serve on the AAC Advisory Group for Massachusetts Advocates for Children. I am a member of the Berkshire Association for Behavior Analysis and Therapy, Mass ABA, the Association for Behavior Analysis International, and the corresponding Speech-Language Pathology and Applied Behavior Analysis Special Interest Group. Okay. So I have a question for you.
Yeah.
Do you get nervous when we read that?
A little bit.
This is, I think, our 15th, 16th recording, maybe?
Yeah.
And I still get nervous when we read this intro.
Because it's like the scripted thing.
Is that weird?
Well, it's because you don't want to, for me, I don't want to screw
I don't want to mess it up. It's like because I don't know what will happen. Are the script police going to come after us? I guess we would just have to do it over, and that would be annoying. I don't know. Trying to think about what contingencies are participating in my anxiety. Moving on. Amy, what are we talking about today?
Well, today we are talking about private practice.
So we have already done an episode on private practice, but this one is slightly different because we are going to be reviewing documentation, logistics, and staffing. And our first episode, for those of you who haven't listened, was related to liability concerns and financial issues. In that episode, we talked about the difference between incorporating or being a sole proprietor or being a DBA. We reviewed budget considerations and taxes. So if you haven't listened to that episode, we definitely recommend it. Today's episode stands alone, I would say. You don't have to listen to the other episode first, but we will be referring back to that episode a little bit in terms of budgetary. Everything is related to the budget. The budget comes first, basically, in any business. So if you are interested in any of those items, feel free to go check it out. I think it was episode 4.
It was an earlier episode.
Yeah, it was episode 4.
Go to the website, find it.
Yeah, it's on our website. People can find it. It's up there.
So why are we talking more about private practice when we've already talked about it one time?
Well, actually, we had a couple of listeners reach out and ask some follow-up questions related to private practice that we didn't cover in that episode. And we figured it would be a good opportunity to just share more detail. For those of you who don't know, I have been a private practice owner for about 10 years or so. I've been in private practice, and I've done a whole variety of things in private practice. I have done brick and mortar, where I had an office. I've done consulting. I've done home visits. I've taken insurance. I've done private pay. I've done private practice by myself. I've done private practice with employees ish. So I have some knowledge to share. And I didn't share this disclaimer in the last episode until like halfway through because I forgot. But I am remembering this time that the disclaimer for this episode is that I am not an accountant and I am not an attorney. Amy,
And
are you an accountant or an attorney?
I am most certainly not an accountant, nor am I an attorney, nor have I ever had a private practice where I have managed any of these things. I had seen a few private clients way back in the day, and the rules and regulations around owning a private practice have really changed since
They
then.
have.
So Kate is my go-to for all of this type of information, or when I entertain the thought of doing some private practice work, and then I remember all of the different parts that are included. So I think this is going to be really interesting for me, just looking through the notes, seeing
So
your
glad. Am I going to teach you something for this rare opportunity? It's usually the other way around. How many people have I worked with over the years where I ask me a question, I say, that's a good question. Let me ask my friend Amy. And this is the only area where I can shine. So I'm gonna take advantage of it.
You have a lot of shot spots, friend, but this is definitely one of them. I know really very little about this, so I'm excited to learn about all of these different components that go along, with the budgetary and legal pieces that we talked about in the last podcast.
And sort of just going back to that disclaimer, all of the information that we are going to share today is based on experience. This is just I feel like I'm not old enough to call myself an experienced person, but I will say that this is all based on my experience owning and running a private practice for the last 10 years. So there are going to be some things that we cover that are very specific, especially to the state where you live. And I we both always encourage people to reach out to an accountant, reach out to an attorney. We covered this a little bit in the other episode. It is worth the money to pay an attorney or an accountant for a 1-hour consult just to have a point of reference and make sure that you're doing some things in basic compliance. None of the information in this episode is legal advice or accounting advice. We always recommend that you talk to your local expert. Now that is out of the way, let's review our learning objectives for the day.
And this information will help you have formulated questions and a plan for when you do meet with your legal and financial expert.
Yes.
So having this background information is going to be very helpful for when you reach that point in time, because you will have a background walking in.
Totally. And we can talk about this a little bit as we go through, but one of the best ways to use an accountant and attorney is to draft your own documents, draft your own policies, and then pay for their time just to review them. You don't have to pay them to come up with these things for you. So hopefully you can take the information from this episode to sort of craft your own set of documents and policies and procedures. Okay, learning objectives. Amy, you want to read them for us?
Yeah. So our learning objectives today, first, we're going to identify the required and recommended components of documentation in private practice. Next, we'll talk about the logistical considerations and some possible solutions. And last, we're going to identify issues related to hiring employees and staffing.
Yes. And I think we're also going to maybe talk a little bit about the structure of staffing and maybe do a little bit of a shameless plug for a future episode on mentorship and how important that is when you have staff. It's not just about supervision. It's about creating a culture where people can learn and grow, and more brains are always better than one brain. No one will ever convince me otherwise. But yeah, shameless plug for a future episode. Okay. So first learning objective.
Documentation, take it away. What do I need to do, and how is it different?
Documentation seems so boring, doesn't it? But the thing about private practice is that if you don't have the right documentation, you can get in a whole heap of trouble. So you really
Trouble's bad.
right. I feel like a lot of people are motivated to just motivated to have, learn more about documentation just to avoid, any of these issues that could come up. So we're going to talk about documentation, the recommended components of documentation, and then the required components of documentation. There are so many different pieces of documentation in private practice. There's the intake paperwork that you give your families and your clients. There's how you document your billing. It's really overwhelming. We're going to have a handful of free downloads on our website, as well as a couple of super, super cheap little startup packety things that are available that we hope are helpful to sort of get things up and going. In terms of the discussion, in terms of, reviewing these different kinds of documentation, I thought it made sense to review clinical documentation first. When I say clinical documentation, I mean your, the notes that you're writing after each session, evaluations, any piece of documentation where you're really talking about your therapeutic activities and what was involved in your clinical work. So we know that clinicians have to take data. Another shameless plug to our episode about data collection. That was episode 3. Data collection is really, really important. So we all know that we need to take data. We all know that we need to document our work. It's in our code of ethics, but the level of documentation that is required varies widely by setting. Wouldn't you agree?
I completely agree. I mean, just thinking about the difference between when you're in a school-based environment versus an outpatient environment, I think a lot of that for me in the different environments where I've worked, I think a lot of it's tied to the funding source, and different funding sources sort of require different types of documentation for reimbursement. But every place has their own kind of set rules about what they like and what are the minimum and kind of recommended criteria for documentation.
Right. And if you're working in a setting where you can get away with a SOAP note, right?
Mhm.
That's sort of your like scribbled. I remember when I was in one of my graduate school placements, my supervisor at the time literally scribbled something on a scrap of paper and like shoved it in a folder. And I was like, what the hell is that? That's not, in my mind, it was like not documentation. That probably wasn't very good practice on her part, but documentation really can vary. When you're in private practice, I would definitely recommend that documentation stay in that spectrum of like, your very casual SOAP note to your very, very structured, highly detailed note. You definitely want to be on the more highly structured, detailed end of that spectrum. And that's for a couple of different reasons. I found this great article by, I'm going to I feel like I always botch the names, but it's, I think, Nikjeh, Nikjeh, and Carol. Or maybe it's Swedish and it's the J makes a Y sound. Not sure. Anyway, there's this great article. The link will be up on our website, Nikjeh and Carol from 2010. And it was published in Perspectives on Voice and Voice Disorders, which is random because the article didn't really talk about voice and voice disorders that much. It was really primarily related to private practice. This article is really, really awesome. If you read nothing else related to this episode, definitely download this article. If you're an Asher and NISLA member, it is available to you. In this article, they really make the point that in private practice, clinical documentation needs to be detailed enough where it will stand alone as a legal document. So if you have a problem or you get sued or something happens, you have your documentation to back you up.
Well, and this is where I feel like a lot of the things that you're doing and that we'll talk about throughout this podcast today are about anticipating problems before they happen. Right?
CYA.
Yeah.
Do you know what that stands for?
I do. I know it.
I'm not going to cover your beep.
Beep. Yeah.
I'm not going to curse on this one. I cursed on one of the last ones. I'm going to be so clean because I'm so clean. I'm so innocent. Anyway, moving on. So CYA is the big takeaway for all of private practice as far as I'm concerned. It's like one of my biggest things. And in terms of clinical documentation and this article, which I thought was very helpful, you need to think about each clinical document being able to stand alone as a legal document. You can get audited, especially if you're receiving payments from Medicare. So without going down a whole tangent, there is something called the Recovery Audit Contractor Program, which is essentially a program that runs at the government level to audit private practices and correct overpayment to practitioners. And it basically means if you take Medicare funding, you can go and have your practice audited, and it can cause a whole host of problems. So if you, for some reason, take Medicare, you should look into that and make sure that your documentation is really, really, really tight. I don't know many private practitioners who take Medicare, but that is just like a tiny little side note. At the end of the day, your documentation can always be used in any dispute, even if you are not being audited. So any kind of dispute, a billing dispute, disputes about clinical decision making. And this article in Perspectives on Voice and Voice Disorders from 2010, they make really, really valid points about the quality of clinical documentation in private practice and what it needs to include. And I'm going to read these points. So number one, documentation should accurately and completely describe the procedures that were used. Number two, they have to be dated and signed. Sort of a no-brainer. But you can't do a SOAP note. You have to date it and you have to sign it. Number three, they should be error-free and understandable to any reader. Now, this is a really important one, I think, because if you are having a dispute with a client or a former client or the teacher of a former client, and you've used a whole bunch of technical jargon, that could end up leading to problems. So I think that was a really good point. And the second point that I'll make about using jargon or making your note understandable is that if you use insurance and you get audited or reviewed or something gets denied, most people who are reviewing the case or the claim are not speech pathologists. Most of the time, there will be a nurse or other medical practitioner who's reviewing your documentation and might not be up to terms with the jargon. So make sure that your documentation is error-free and understandable to any reader.
And in looking through your notes, preparing for this episode, I thought that this was a very interesting piece because I think my tendency would be in the other direction, right? I'm trying to
Totally.
be very clear about all the things I did. I'm going to use all my fancy speech language pathology terms so people understand this is real and warranted. So I think that's a really interesting point for me, that it should be easily understandable to a non-speech language pathologist.
Definitely. And which that sort of leads into their fourth point, was that documentation should support the need for skilled services and be related to the diagnosis. So your document really does have to reflect why the individual is participating in services. That means you probably need to make sure you have the diagnosis written on your document, even if you are in private, even if you're not accepting insurance, because the family could be submitting that as a super bill to their insurance to be reimbursed. And finally, and I thought this was such a good point that I actually have the quote, and it's from page 33 in this article. If it was not documented, it was not done. It was not said. It did not happen. That is so important. If you have any concerns about anything that has happened in your session, document, document, document. How many times in a work setting have you passed the buck to your boss? Let me ask my administrator. I'm not really sure about that. Let me double check. When you are in private practice, you are the end of the line. So if you do not document it, it did not happen. It was not said. It was not done. And I cannot hammer that point. This is a CYA moment. No question about it.
Yeah. And it's a huge responsibility.
Yes.
So to identify yourself, I think most speech language pathologists, we are familiar with working in environments where there is this whole administrative structure that's supportive. You're able to go to, perhaps you have middle management and then management above those people and then management above those people.
And they have lawyers and attorneys. Like, somebody's going to figure it out. It's not going to, you're covered under that umbrella. But when you're standing alone, you have to make sure that your document completely encapsulates all of these things to CYA. I'm not cursing at all. I'm doing such a good job.
You are doing such a good job. Good job.
Anybody who knows me outside of a podcast knows that that's not always the case. Even my children would probably tell you that, which is terrible. Okay, so based on these guidelines, we've got these 5 guidelines from this awesome article. What does that mean? What kinds of things need to go into your clinical documentation then? And I sort of brainstormed a little bit and came up with a list. And all of this will be, I know this is a lot of information and a lot of lists. So all of this is going to be in the handout that's available on the website. And in the private practice startup packet that we have on our website, there's a sample note that you can download. So all of these things will be listed there as well. But so in the interest of CYA, you want to make sure you have your visit number. So how many visits have you had with the individual? This is definitely related to insurance if there is a dispute over insurance and what the benefit was, because every insurance has, they have a limit to the number of visits that were authorized. Some insurances will have a number of visits authorized in a date. So you get 8 visits before June 30th, and whichever one comes first, then you have to submit for more visits. So you want to make sure you have a record in your note of how many times you have seen that client. You want to make sure that you have a referral number or authorization number or expiration date related to that insurance. Sometimes families, if you're doing a private pay, they may be using your clinical documentation to get reimbursed through a third party, and they might need a place to write the authorization number or a referral number or expiration dates that are relevant. What activities did you do? This can be a description. Insurance deals a lot with codes. You need your CPT code or whatever. You could put a CPT code on there. You could also just write played with bubbles or, constructed a village out of Play-Doh and used complete sentences to describe the village or whatever. So you have to describe exactly what your therapeutic activities were and then make sure that it's clear in your documentation what the clinical purpose was. So I wouldn't just say bubbles, but maybe you say bubbles looking for lip rounding or bubbles looking for, specifically targeting requests, or bubbles related to 2-word utterances, more bubbles, big bubbles, little bubbles, lots of bubbles. I don't know, anything like that. You want to make sure you document instances where things maybe didn't go well. So you had a visit where the child was under the table for the entire session and you couldn't get them out, or the child was having a tantrum, or, I work in pediatrics, so I'm coming up with lots of pediatric related examples. But if that happens for 4 weeks in a row, are you doing any therapeutic activity or are you doing behavior management? Or if you had a situation where the entire visit was related to counseling or parent discussions about or something that's happening at home, and you see in your clinical documentation that happened for 4 weeks in a row, does that tell you something else about other goal areas that you might need to work on with your client? So making sure that your clinical documentation captures even the things that weren't necessarily therapeutically successful. Are there instances where you've recommended a home program? So a home program is a word that's sort of left over from my days working in the hospital where the insurance really required home programming. I think that's also sort of related to like PT. You go to PT and you get your exercises and they tell you that you have to do them at home like 3 days a week or it's not going to get better. Well, it's no different in speech pathology. So you really should make sure that you have, I think most people do, we're working on 2-word utterances. Try and do this at home and then give them some permanent product. Give them a data sheet that they can take home. Give them a description of different ideas. Brainstorm ideas with them. And then document in your note if they came back to your session and they did home programming. If you are taking insurance, there are some insurance plans that will not continue to provide reimbursement without evidence of home programming. That's only happened to me once, but it did happen. And was a long time ago. So regulations may have changed, but it's something definitely to consider.
I think all of these things too, when you think about making a template or having some form of, structure for taking your notes and putting all these things in there. I mean, a lot of these things could fit into that like SOAP note structure, subjective, objective assessment plan. You just need more boxes. You need more there. So you could, it seems to me you could put those things into that structure if that structure is what's familiar to you. You just need to make sure to put in all of these other parts.
Well, you need a prompt. You need a reminder.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, but if you send your documentation to insurance for review and it's like a whole page of a narrative, they're not reading that. They're just
Mhm.
not, I have dealt with enough Medicaid reviewers in my career to just have like no faith that anybody is reading a long narrative. They're looking for a table. They're looking for like a quick visual cue when they scan the page to see exactly, whether or not you were in compliance with the patient or client's benefits. Um, and I think that brings me to another point about what to include, in that you want to make sure that you're documenting progress or lack of progress. And we're going to
Right.
talk about that in a second. But if you are documenting progress or lack of progress, you need to consider how you are going to document that on an ongoing basis and how you're going to communicate that to the family. In the hospital or outpatient setting, and in my experience, even in private practice, when I contracted with insurance, a lot of insurances will require reevaluations. So every 3 months, you have to revisit your goals and objectives. You have to look back at your data through your weekly notes or biweekly notes, or however you saw the client. Make sure that you are moving towards your objectives, and then document that in a document. That was really redundant. Document that in a document and submit it to insurance to make sure that you can continue to receive funding. Insurance will not continue to pay for visits that are not clearly therapeutic in nature, and you have to document the therapeutic effectiveness of your treatment, and you have to do that with numbers.
And I think, a related topic for another podcast is knowing that when you begin and write your goals and objectives. So making sure that you do have your time frame in mind. When you're talking about a reevaluation, as somebody who has most recently been in schools, that's typically an annual, you're
Such a
making
good
goals
point.
that are annual. It's a shift to now start writing goals and objectives that kind of need to be achievable within a time frame set by your third party funding source. So being aware of that and being mindful about the ways that you're crafting measurable and achievable goals and objectives is really important. We're not going to talk more about that right now, but we will in a future podcast.
I think it's such a good point. And this sort of brings me to our ethical obligation about offering services that are therapeutic. Um, Principle 1K states individuals who hold the certificate of clinical competence shall evaluate the effectiveness of services provided, technology employed, and products dispensed, and they shall provide services or dispense products only when benefit can reasonably be expected. That is so huge. I have, unfortunately, in my time, come across a handful of private practitioners who I'm sure they are in some way documenting the progress of their clients, but you are ethically obligated to provide services where the benefit can be reasonably expected. And your documentation has to very clearly demonstrate that your services are therapeutic. If you find that your services are not therapeutic, do you have an ethical obligation to discharge that individual from private practice, or brainstorm other ways where it could be more therapeutic? This could be, if you have an individual who has a more severe impairment, or is an emergent learner, or has a more complex body, or has some complex communication needs, and is not demonstrating improvements in a once a week session in your private practice, maybe it isn't the ethical thing to discharge them based on the context, but maybe you need to do more collaboration. Maybe you need to see more interaction with the school teacher to make sure that the therapeutic goals are being worked on in multiple environments. Maybe there are more things that could be done at home. Maybe you need to revisit your goals and objectives, and your goals and objectives are not, you've gotten to know the client better over a 3 to 6 month period, and you've learned that, okay, that original goal was maybe a little bit of a reach. Let's try this. You can't just keep plowing through, just waiting for time to make a magic wand. We are really ethically obligated to make sure that our services are, and this is literally, I'm reading it from our ethical code, are you have to continue to provide services where the benefit can be reasonably expected. And I know that that's a gray area and open to interpretation, but it's very important in private practice to make sure that you have that clearly documented, not only in your weekly note or your biweekly note, but also in progress notes or reevaluations or whatever you want to call them.
And I think that that's important for everybody to think about all the time, right? And not being stuck into this very rigid structure of what service looks like. So that's, when you have a client and you're continually reevaluating their goals and objectives and their progress or lack of progress toward those goals, that should be something that's happening constantly and something that makes you consider, whether you're in private practice or not, makes you consider the appropriateness of those goals and objectives, whether there are things that you can do within your implementation that you could modify the way that you're, providing your therapy that could help move toward achieving those goals and objectives, and thinking about your service delivery models. I think
that's such a good point.
Having been outpatient, which is kind of what I'm picturing as you're talking through all of these private practice components, 1 times 30 outpatient, separately from the world that the individual lives in, may not be the right service delivery model. That might be a service delivery model problem, not a goals and objectives problem. So it's a nice kind of recheck to make sure that you're thinking about all of those variables, thinking about service delivery models, thinking about goals and objectives, thinking about therapeutic intervention approaches.
And I think the other, piece to piggyback onto that is that we're ethically obligated to evaluate effectiveness, and that requires data. It requires something that is not your opinion. It cannot be solely subjective. And remember, again, just back to our podcast, our episode about data collection, data can be qualitative, but it has to be something that is an objective measurement of the client's progress.
Well, and having been a relatively recent consumer of physical therapy myself, like I don't want to spend.
We are not old.
40, no, not at all. I don't want to spend 45 minutes at home doing my clamshell, with the green band if I'm never going to make it to the red band, right? I mean, like, I'm going in, I'm doing my 45-minute session with my PT. I'm paying for that. I have my little home exercise. I take them home, doing my clamshells, and if I were never making progress, that's a waste of everybody's time, and it's a use of my money that I would rather allocate elsewhere. So
and that's resources, right. And we're ethically obligated to make sure that we're in providing effective service, that the families that we're serving are using their resources effectively. And that just goes back to your comment about service delivery. Is a consultation with the classroom teacher a better use of your time?
Right.
Or is that a better service delivery model in private practice? I think there's a lot of different ways that you can look at that. But sort of zooming back out again, thinking about documentation and clinical documentation, we've reviewed a lot of the different components. I think the bottom line is that it definitely needs to be on the more detailed end of that spectrum, and be able to stand alone as a legal document and be written to the funding source.
Right. There are specific things that you have to include, it sounds like. That
ethically, and yes.
Yeah. So
Definitely.
check the list. Okay.
Right. Okay. Moving on to HIPAA. HIPAA is always so fun. So there are additional requirements related to HIPAA. So if you are accepting insurance, you are considered a covered entity and you must abide by HIPAA. What we already reviewed in the first private practice episode, that our ethical code, puts paramount the privacy and security of our patients and clients and their data. We are required that we give informed consent, all of these kinds of things. So ASHA really does say, even if you are not accepting insurance, you really should be in compliance with HIPAA. We have more links about HIPAA requirements that are on our website based on the Department of Health and Human Services. But when you are in private practice, based on whether or not you take insurance, we really are required not only to comply with HIPAA in terms of patient security and patient privacy and security of their information, but we're required to give them a privacy policy notice. We are required to inform them of their rights under the HIPAA law. Now, we have a page on our website that gives you more. It's a link to the Health and Human Services, the Department of Health and Human Services page, and it gives more options for me. It gives more information about meeting these requirements, but I'm going to read directly from that page. The HIPAA privacy rule requires health plans and covered healthcare providers, that's us, to develop and distribute a notice that provides a clear and user-friendly explanation of individuals' rights with respect to their personal health information and the privacy practices of health plans and healthcare providers. So you're required to share with your clients and patients what their rights are under the HIPAA law, what you do with their health information, and what you do to make sure that that health information is protected. The HHS.gov website has a link where you can generate your own HIPAA privacy policy, and then it gives you. So once you have your HIPAA privacy policy, you have to give your client a piece of paper that acknowledges that you gave them the policy. I'm stumbling over my words here really aggressively. But basically, everybody's done this when they go to the doctor. It's not necessarily the consent for information, but you acknowledge that you sign a piece of paper that says you gave me the HIPAA privacy notice. I have been made aware of my rights. We have to do the same thing with our clients. So we give them a copy of the HIPAA privacy policy, and then we give them another piece of paper where they sign that they acknowledge that they received the privacy policy. That piece of paper that you give them that they sign, you keep it forever. The right answer might not be forever, but you really need to CYA. You keep it for your records so that you can show in case of an audit or in case of a legal issue or in case of anything that you were compliant with the HIPAA law. That's super important. That was a really difficult one for me to get out there. I feel like I stumbled over my words, but hopefully that was clear. So go ahead.
Is that privacy policy link at hhs.gov? Is that something people can just do for free? Is that something you have to? That's nice.
No, it's really great. They have a lot of really great resources on their website, and it's just a little pack. It's pretty user-friendly little packets that you can download for free. So in terms of informed consent, we need to give them our HIPAA privacy policy, the notice of acknowledgement that the thing that they signed, that they acknowledge that we gave them the HIPAA privacy policy. We also have to give them a consent to release form. That is I sort of feel like that's a no-brainer. Most people are pretty familiar with that. So Amy, if you were my client, you might write on your consent form that I could talk to the teacher, I could talk to your family member. If you're, a consenting adult, I could talk to, I don't know, other professionals who are involved in your care. Those are the kinds of things that go on a consent to release. You need to make sure that if you have student volunteers or other clinicians in your practice, that they are listed, that they are also given a consent form. So I think in private practice, having student volunteers is great because it's great experience for the student and it's free. You can have somebody help you make materials, help you with the sessions, but that student also needs to sign a piece of paper that they acknowledge that they are being given access to private information, that they are not allowed to talk, that they are also being held to the HIPAA law. They are not allowed to talk about your clients in the hallway. They're not allowed to go home and, spew a bunch of private information to their roommates or to their family members. So you need to make sure that everybody in your practice who is interacting with the client is made aware that they are held to the privacy policy of your office. You need to make sure that your clients or patients are given a use of media consent. So how are you ever taking pictures of them? Are you using the materials that you made for your session at a conference? Are you taking videos of your session to use as teaching materials? Are you using it as advertising on your website or on social media? You need to make sure that they've all of that information has been clearly distributed to them and that they've signed off on it. Telepractice. This is another huge thing that's happening right now.
Sure is.
Telepractice requires its own consent. So how are you going to ensure that your patient or client information is private through electronic communication? I mean, I think it's pretty obvious. Everybody knows you need to use a HIPAA or FERPA compliant video channel. But outside of that, what precautions are you making to make sure that nobody can hear the audio in your house? What precautions are you taking to make sure that no one else can see your screen? What precautions are you taking when you email? Are your emails encrypted? You know, electronic communication is a lot more than just a Zoom phone call that, you know, we're all so familiar with this now, but there are specific consents that should be given for telepractice. I think most people probably know that by now, but just for the sake of saying it. So those are all of the things that I could sort of come up with related to informed consent and HIPAA. But sadly, the list of documentation goes on.
Goes on and on.
It goes on and on. CYA. There's always room to cover your bum. I'll say bum. Boop. Incident reports. What if you have rented space or you were playing with, you know, you were doing a home visit and somebody cut themselves with scissors, or somebody fell in your office and hit their head on a table by accident and they have a horrible bruise? What did you do? What happened? What are the consequences? So you need to make sure that you have an incident report form. Document is always the theme of the day. Your incident form or your incident report should include the client's name, the location of the incident, who was present when it happened, what happened, a description of the incident, what you did in response to the incident, who you notified as a result of the incident. It should have a date on it. It should have your signature on it. You could consider having the parent or guardian sign it when you review it with them. You know, so Johnny hit his head. This is what happened. This is what I did in response to it. This is definitely an area I would highly recommend having an attorney look at it, because it's clearly related to a liability if somebody hurt themselves while they were either, especially if you have a rented space and it was on your, you know, sort of on your watch. You need to make sure that the families are aware if there was another person there. So does that volunteer, does that student clinician, does that observing professional have consent to be a part of that session? That was sort of related to the other section. But what about home programming and data sheets? We sort of already talked about that. And so that sort of encapsulates the CYA, I think, component of this in terms of privacy policy, HIPAA notices, and incident reports. I think one of the last things related to paperwork that I wanted to go over was intake paperwork. So this is the drier, sort of more administrative-y components. So we've reviewed just to sort of recap, we've reviewed the clinical documentation piece, we've reviewed the informed consent and HIPAA privacy policy, the CYA of having an incident report. But now we're going to talk about what kind of paperwork do you give your client when they're a new client into your practice. And this is sort of touching on some of the business components and administrative components of your practice. I always provide my families with a welcome letter. So if they're new to the practice, if you are, you know, you make an appointment at a dermatologist's office, you might have a lot of questions about, you know, well, do you have students? Is this a teaching hospital? Am I going to have 8 doctors in the room? You know, what should I expect when I come to your practice? Does your practice have rules? I have one doctor's office where they have the signs in the waiting room that says, please no cell phones. And you just like ignore those, right? Like you still pull out your phone.
Yeah.
Yeah, you ignore them. I got told to put mine away. They were like, don't you see the sign? They took it really seriously.
Wow.
I mean, that would have been nice to know in the welcome letter. We strongly enforce our cell phone. I would have brought a book. I don't know.
Well, you see sometimes like places that have the signs about like scents, right? Like we're like, please don't wear perfumes and other
I've never
things.
seen that sign.
Yeah, I feel like my dermatologist maybe has a sign like that. But either way, yes, anything like that. And it also is how you welcome your person,
Yeah.
right?
You
Like,
want them to have a clear understanding of what to expect.
yeah.
I think that's really important. So yeah, intake paperwork, a welcome letter. I think it's really, really helpful to have a welcome letter. And all of these forms are included in the little thingy that we have on the practice startup packet that we have on our website. A client history, that's sort of a no-brainer. All the consent and permissions that we talked about, the HIPAA notice, the HIPAA acknowledgement, consent to release information to people, consent for student volunteers or student clinicians or, volunteers of any kind. And then this is a doozy, the contract. This is the part where you tell them that you charge money. This is so uncomfortable for almost all of us. Almost all of us. I think I have yet to meet someone who's like, I love telling my families that they're going to pay me X number of dollars. This is one of the biggest questions I get is how much to charge and how do you tell people what you charge? And my answer is always, well, it depends. There is no clear answer about how much you charge. It's based on region, levels of expertise. It varies widely. I am not going to talk about that in detail, but I would encourage people to, do some market research in your area to see if you can get a feel for what the range is. It definitely varies widely. And you need to put your pricing in your contract. So the things that go into a student contract or a client contract are a lot. You need to outline your policies for cancellations. Cancellations are huge, especially in the pediatric population. Are you going to have a strict cancellation policy, or are you going to be more flexible because you have telepractice and you have a lot more flexibility? So if they cancel on Monday, you can probably see them Friday. Are you working with accent modification and adults over telepractice, where if you have a cold, it's not really going to affect whether or not we can get some good therapeutic work done. You need to have a clear outline or policy for non-payment or a return check. This is like the littlest thing, right? But I have been burned. CYA, it happens. You need to have a clear policy about what happens when there is non-payment on account. You need to have information about your pricing and what services you offer for what prices. So depending on your clinical area of expertise, are you offering evaluations? Are you offering consultation? Are you offering, direct speech services? Is there a different pricing structure for those kinds of things? We were talking a little bit before this podcast about how you charge for services. So once upon a time, it was sort of frowned upon to charge for services that had not been rendered.
And by frowned upon, you mean part of our code of ethics.
Yes, it was in our code of ethics.
Yeah, back in 2002, 2003, it was Rule M of Principle 1. And it said, individuals shall not charge for services not rendered, nor shall they misrepresent services rendered, products dispensed, or research and scholarly activities conducted.
Which is very clear.
Yeah.
That's very, very clear. Now, in rereading the code of ethics, there was not anything that was as frowned upon, as clear.
No. And there were a couple of places where in my reading of it, it seems like that intent had been sort of reallocated. Looking at Principle 1, Section Q, individuals shall maintain timely records and accurately record and bill for services provided and products dispensed, and shall not misrepresent services provided, products dispensed, or research and scholarly activities conducted. You can find it again in Principle 3, but it's not as explicit. So we would say,
I would say if you were interested in bundling services, so I have seen this before where it's, buy 6 treatment sessions and get the 7th one for free and pay up front, right? This is like, when you go to like I feel like
massage.
a massage place. Yeah.
Nothing like that's their thing.
Yeah. So if you are looking at your budget and you're looking at your business model and this is something that you want to consider, I would definitely call the ASHA Action Center before putting that into place, only because that was such a clear violation of our ethical code. I don't know, when did they change it? 10 years ago?
It gets revised a little bit on a regular basis.
On a regular basis. So I don't really even know when it changed, but it was such a clear violation at some point that I would definitely maybe even just because, CYA, I would definitely maybe even write the Action Center and see if you could get it in writing to make sure that that was a clear, you got the green light on that. But back to the contract. So when you're, considering your pricing and what services are offered, you want to make sure that it's unequivocally clear. Are you going to bill the same rate for paperwork? Are you not going to bill for paperwork? Are you going to bill for writing time? Are you going to bill for IEP review? Are you going to bill for going to a team meeting? Are you going to bill that at a different rate? All of those things have to be very clearly outlined in your contract so that if at any, just like the rest of the documentation, if there are any issues, you have a clear foundation from which to spring off of.
And as a non-lawyer person, just somebody who's been part of contracts before, I think the rule is that any ambiguity in the contract comes back on the person who wrote the contract. So if you don't make these things really clear in your contract, that's on you as the contract.
Right. So that's basically paperwork in a nutshell. There are lots of ways that you can distribute this information. You can snail mail it. Now, these days, you can just have like a form and PDF it and send it off for somebody to e-sign. If you're using electronic medical record software like Simple Practice or one of the other ones, they have a lot of these forms built in that you can customize and then email them off and they go into a patient portal. But that's also an expense. Signing up for these electronic medical record platforms is something to consider in terms of your budget. You don't have to have it. You can just use Word documents. It's fine. Okay. Second learning objective. We're really, really into this. We're going to go through some of these. The documentation was definitely meatier than the last two learning objectives, but we will cruise through them. So logistical considerations. Logistical considerations are, to me, really the nuts and bolts of how you run your business on a day-to-day basis. Referral sources, scheduling, billing, file storage, contact information, how you make your logo, all of that kind of stuff. So I think we reviewed this a lot in our first episode related to private practice. Referral sources. You do not have a business if you do not have customers. This has to be your number one priority, is to get customers. Your referral sources are going to be huge. I would highly recommend going directly to the people who make the referrals, doctors' offices, other SLPs. We are a shortage. There are not enough of us. There is work to be had. There are, at least in our area, private SLPs and private practice. We refer to each other all the time. This is not a business where you're hoarding your business and not sharing it with people, at least not in our geographical area. Maybe that's different in other places in the world, but definitely reach out and network with other SLPs in your area. Go to the doctor's offices and drop off. Every medical office I've ever worked in had a referral list. And if you got flagged for a language delay, they handed you the list of local speech pathologists to call. Yep. If you take insurance is a massive referral source because, families log into their insurance and search for speech and language pathologist. I would also highly recommend registering with a Google pin. How often, if you're like, I wonder if there's pizza around here, and you go into your Google Maps and you search it and you wait for the pin to drop. People do the same thing with speech pathology and every other local professional. And I'm pretty sure it's free. So if you don't want to, that does mean that you have a brick and mortar. If you don't want to have an office space and you don't want your personal address registered, I don't think you can do a Google pin with a PO box, but you can get a PO box. It's not that expensive. And that way you can put your PO box on billing documents. There are some places that require an actual address. So that might be something to look into, but I would definitely recommend getting a PO box if you don't have a brick and mortar. Scheduling. You need to have a HIPAA compliant scheduling system. If you pay for an electronic medical record system, that will often be included, but you can't use a Google Calendar and have your clients' names in it. That is a HIPAA violation. Don't do it unless you have G Suite and you've signed the BAA agreement and now your G Suite is HIPAA compliant. So make sure that however you are keeping track of your schedule, it is HIPAA compliant. In terms of billing and administrative support, you could consider a billing service. Billing is a pain in the butt in private practice. It requires, we were just having this conversation before we recorded this podcast. It requires so much administrative time, especially if you have insurance, you do your visit, you do your clinical work, you do your documentation, and then you have to file the claim. And then you have to follow the claim for the life of the claim to make sure that it gets paid out. And it is such a pain in the butt. So you could consider hiring a billing service. My understanding is that billing services take a percentage of what is paid out. So they're motivated to make sure that you get paid because they don't get paid if you get paid. A lot of EMRs, electronic medical record services, will have billing options as add-ons in case you get to a volume where you feel like you can't handle the administrative burden of doing billing. I know Simple Practice has a back end of house billing. Again, does that work with your budget? It's just another thing of overhead. So every time you add overhead, your net income shrinks and shrinks and shrinks. So it's definitely something to consider. It all comes back down to the budget. You could also consider hiring an administrator for an hourly rate. This is something I know a few people who have done. It's something I've considered doing in the past. You can hire them as a contractor or an hourly employee. We're going to go through the difference between those two things in a minute. But an administrator can help with some of the burdens of non-billable time. So in private practice, you're doing all of your billable time and non-billable administrative time. And it does get to a point where if you have a certain amount of volume in terms of billable hours, that means you have all of this extra non-billable time. Sometimes it makes sense in your budget, if you have a volume of this big, where you should pay an administrator to do the administrative stuff, because then you can bill more hours. So if you're doing 3 hours a day of administrative non-billable stuff, you could hire an administrator to do that for you at a lower rate and then spend that 3 hours. That's 3 additional hours you could bill. Those are all things to consider related to your budget. But they are administrators. I mean, anybody who's worked in an office knows how valuable a good administrator is.
For sure.
Definitely. File storage has to be HIPAA compliant. Again, looking at that EMR software, I've heard of WebPT, Simple Practice. I know Microsoft Teams is really trying to compete in this space now. Everybody's using Zoom these days, but Zoom doesn't have a corresponding HIPAA compliant e-software. If you're just using email and keeping everything on your desktop, that's fine. But I would highly encourage you to back up your computer with a military grade encrypting software so that if it gets dropped in the toilet or in the bathtub or in the pool, you don't lose your records.
And I think even with the email, if you're using email, you still need to make sure that email is HIPAA compliant.
Yes, and that it's encrypted if you're sending documents back and forth, which is a service that you need to pay for. You cannot do it in Google. Don't use Gmail for your private practice.
Unless you have G Suite with the BAA.
Exactly, unless you have G Suite, which is HIPAA compliant.
But you pay for
that. Right, exactly. Phone and contact information. I know a lot of people who don't want to give out their cell phone numbers. I don't blame them. You could consider using Google Voice if you have G Suite with a BAA. Google Voice has a free version. It is not HIPAA compliant. If patient calls you and leaves you a voicemail that has patient information on it, that is not HIPAA compliant. Don't do it. There are other options out there. If you just Google it, there are lots of other suggestions. I've used Google Voice for a while, so that's the only one that I'm aware of off the top of my head. On to some of the funner things. A logo. I get this question all the time. I don't know why. I think my logo is like sort of terrible too. So I'm not sure why people ask me about this, but in terms of graphic design and things, I'm not a graphic designer, but there are other resources that you can use. There are lots of licensing restrictions when you start talking about logo and how to make yourself present as as a business in terms of marketing materials. So I would be very careful, but there are some third parties that you can subscribe to buy the licensing for an image. Canva is one of them. There are lots of them. I think, what's the name of that? Something photography. I can't remember. I'll put some links up on the website. But there's a third party called 99 Designs, where if you pay a fee, I can't remember. It's not terribly exorbitant. I think it's like $100 or $200, somewhere in that range. You get matched. You submit a request for what your business is, and then they do this roulette. So like 5 or 6 graphic designers will come up with a design, and you get to choose, and then you go with that designer, and it's all, the fees are all like wrapped up in it. So there are ways out there if you don't feel like you have. I was very overwhelmed with this for a while. Do you remember when I first made my business cards? I'm going to tell everyone this story. I'm going to take the time and tell everyone this story. So when I first launched my private practice, it was Greater Boston Speech and Language Therapy. And I thought, okay, I need to make a logo. My sister had Adobe, and she made this logo for me, and it was so pretty. It had all of my favorite colors. It was gray and blue. And I just told her to use the words SLT up at the top for speech and language therapy, so that it was clear to my clients, like what I did. And I showed this business card to Amy. And do you remember what you said to me? You do?
I think it would break it like you put a U in there.
No, you were like, that looks like slut.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
I was like, oh my God. And I was so bummed. I was like, you're right. And I had spent like hours designing this thing. So don't be me. Don't make a business card that says slut on it. Go to one of these third-party companies and have them make a logo for you. There's lots of different options. I don't know why I always get that question, but I do. I guess it's because they maybe saw my slut business card, and they were like, tell me what not to do.
This feels like a learning experience.
Yeah, right. Learn from my mistakes. CYA. Anyway, and the other question I get a lot is renting space. Do I rent space or do I not rent space? So space is a huge drain on overhead, massive. It's expensive, but it really depends on your volume. So your gas mileage can be tax deductible, but if you're driving from house to house to house, and you at the end of the day realize that you spent 3 hours in your car, is the value of that 3 hours more over time, that billable time, that's 3 clients or 4 clients, depending on how long your sessions are, that you could have seen? And does that income outweigh the cost of the rent that you would pay? Again, all these decisions come down to your budget. One thing that I have had success with in the past is office shares. So, for example, I shared an office with an acupuncturist for a while, and she had the office through 3 days a week. I had the office the other days a week, and it was awesome. And the lease was under her name, and I had a sublease, and it was super affordable, and I had my own space, and I had my own little closet of materials. It was fabulous. So if this is something that you're doing maybe part-time, or something that you're sort of dipping your toes into, I would definitely recommend looking into an office share. Please do not buy a space. I have had that question also, because then you have a mortgage and you are responsible for paying that mortgage, and that is a massive, massive drain on overhead. So don't do that. Don't buy anything. Even like huge businesses don't buy their buildings. It's not a good investment. From my experience, and I can't explain why, but my husband's in business and he told me not to do it. So just don't do it. You could, like I said, you can consider a PO box if you want to protect your personal address. But the decision on whether or not to rent space is really rooted in your volume and your budget. In terms of, that was pretty much everything I had for logistics. We cruised right through that. I feel like I'm talking a mile a minute. I hope that all of this is understandable. But learning objective number 3, identifying issues related to hiring employees and staffing. So the biggest thing I have to say about this is, well, I guess there's a couple of things that go into this. Employees are appropriate when you have a super long wait list and when you're really interested in growing your business.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that it's a great idea to like hire an employee unless you have clients to give them, because then you're responsible for an employee and you have to that's just bad employee employer relationships to hire someone and then not have work to give them, especially if they're per diem and they have taken a job with you because they would like some income.
Right.
So you really need to make sure that you have the volume to um, consider hiring an employee. Now, when you hire an employee, this is a massive disclaimer. These things vary tremendously from state to state. And if you're in a position where you're considering hiring an employee, I cannot say this enough. You need an accountant. You really need, maybe you don't have someone doing your books every month, but you should pay the money. It is worth the money to sit with an accountant for an hour or 2 hours and ask them all the questions about payroll and taxes and have them help you build a budget. There is a budget available on our website that you can download that is not related to taxes, and it doesn't have any information related to employees. But if you are interested in a budget related to employees, please contact me. I may or may not have some forms or some budgets that I could send you. But you have to have I really recommend that you have an accountant in your back pocket if hiring employees is something that you're interested in.
And you're going to want an attorney too, because you're going to have a contract just like you do with your clients and your patients.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. So when you hire an employee, there are so many things that you need to consider. You have to you have to pay their state and federal unemployment tax. You have to pay their payroll tax. You pay them, you have to do all of the math. You have to pay them a certain percentage. You have to make sure that it's financially viable, that they're bringing more money into your company than you're paying them. It's a super, super complicated component of running a practice. And it adds additional overhead. You have to pay for payroll services. You have to pay for workers' comp. You have to pay for professional liability insurance. It opens a whole host of complicating factors, which is why I am not even going to sit in front of this microphone and say for 2 seconds that this podcast equips you to go out and hire an employee. You really, really, really need to go find an accountant if this is something that you're interested in doing. I think the biggest thing that I can say about hiring employees and staffing is that this is a question that I have been getting a lot, is the difference between an employee and a contractor. So employees and contractors are two very different things. What constitutes an employee versus a contractor is designated by the Department of Health and Human Services. And it's very, very specific. And you can get into a lot of trouble for delegating someone improperly. So if you're treating them as an employee, but they're delegated as an independent contractor, that's a big no-no. People are more motivated, I think, to delegate people as independent contractors because it's cheaper. When you have hired someone as an independent contractor, you are not responsible for paying any of that long list of things I just read. You don't need to pay for for workers' comp. You don't need to pay their employment, all of the additional federal unemployment tax and payroll taxes and all of those kinds of things. You give them a 1099 and then they pay their own taxes. So it's much simpler, it's much more affordable, and it's much more appealing to an employer, but it is not necessarily the right thing to do.
And if you do the wrong thing and the person is actually an employee, which a lot of the case, they are an employee, and I know you'll go through some of these pieces later, but if they are an employee, then you broke the rules.
Yeah,
You
don't break
can't
the rules.
choose-
It
Yeah,
gives me
you can't
heebie-jeebies.
choose. Yeah, CYA. It's
Yeah,
another.
yeah, yeah. Just like don't break the rules. So we have the link on our website to the Department of Health and Human Services that if you are curious about this and you're at a point in your private practice where you're considering hiring an employee and you're wondering about some of these things, go visit this link, read through this page. Some of the delegating factors are related to the following. I'm just going to read them quickly.
Mhm.
Does the company control or have the right to control what the worker does and how the worker does the job? Does the company control the business aspects of the worker's job, like making arrangements for how they're paid, whether expenses are reimbursed, whether or not they use materials that you've provided for them? Is there a written contract or employee benefits, such as a pension plan, insurance plan, or vacation pay? Will the relationship continue? And is the work a key aspect of the business? These are all very complicated questions that, again, an accountant can help you navigate, and you want to make sure that you're making the right
All the
decision.
rules.
You want to make sure that you're following all the rules and that it works with your budget, because while hiring an employee is maybe what you're more comfortable with doing, or what the work lends itself to based on your state, and that's what your accountant has advised you to do, you need to revisit your budget and make sure that all of those additional expenses make sense for the direction that you want your business to grow in. Because if you're thinking of hiring an employee to take one client for you, is that worth it for you at the end of the year to make an extra, X number of dollars? Or does that really only make sense if you build it and scale it to volume? And I think those are questions that you cannot answer without an accountant and a budget in your corner. And that is all I will say about that. End of podcast. End of episode. That was a lot of information.
I feel like it was great.
Your eyes aren't glassing over.
No, this is all content that, as a rules follower, the amount of information and the amount of variables that somebody needs to consider to do a private practice and do it correctly is kind of overwhelming. It's a lot.
It's very overwhelming.
So I feel like, we've talked between the previous podcast and this one, we've talked about a lot of different, the budget is the driver, the CYA is a driver. And then there are all of these different considerations that people really do need to think through.
Definitely. And again, I know I said this in the other episode, but if you have questions, please reach out to me. This is something that I really enjoy doing. I really enjoy helping other speech pathologists and other professionals in general sort of explore this adventure that is private practice. I've had such great experience over the years. And I hope the information in this has been helpful. And I think that wraps us up.
Yeah. Thanks so much for listening, guys.
Yeah. Thank you for listening. Stay tuned for more episodes on, let's see, we had a poll. We had an Instagram poll. So we have AAC and ABA coming up. We have mentoring coming up. We dropped a little hint about an episode related to writing measurable and objectives.
Goals and objectives. Yes.
Measurable objectives and objectives. That made no sense. And yeah, so stay tuned. Thank you for listening, everyone.